So after 2026 began, it felt like we were going again in this accelerationist pace in one perspective with artificial intelligence. And then all these other reports, all these other avenues of thought are painting a completely different story on what artificial intelligence is doing to the environment, where VCs are at, etc. And so for you, you're researching ecologies of technology, which we'll get to later in the episode. What are your thoughts and perspectives on where the industry is at? Is it fueled with optimism or is it fueled with something else?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, they present a view of this kind of almost quite pathological optimism, I would say. And I think underlying that is a degree of intense actual anxiety because I think they know what they're doing is truly extraordinary and has never really been seen before. And if you look at they've recently all the big technology companies have reported in the last few weeks and outlined their plans for 2026. And what we can see is after this enormous spend on new AI data centers and expansion of the AI infrastructure last year, it's going to be even more extreme this year. And they're looking at overall somewhere within, say, 750 billion dollars they're spending this year alone on new data centers. I mean, that's just a phenomenal amount that they're building. And I mean, there's been some comparisons with other sort of technological booms, and it's certainly now bigger in terms of its share of the overall economy than, say, the dot-com boom in the 2000s, early 2000s. It's bigger even than the railway boom that happened in the 19th century, in the 1850s, in lots of different countries. So it's really the biggest technological boom we have ever seen. And it's really important to understand that we still haven't seen how this is actually going to make any money. And so it's a huge bet. And what's extraordinary here is really there is a big question mark now over whether they have enough energy to power this. I think a number of people are saying, a number of people within the AI industry are saying that, look, we're going to be building data centers, and there's simply going to be no power to turn on the chips we're buying because it's going far faster than they can build
Right.
new energy on the US energy grid. And most of these data centers are going into the US currently, although they are going to spread abroad as well. They're spreading into Europe, they're spreading into, I'm sure, Canada, and I'm sure, and across Asia as well. But US is the focus. And also the global capital markets are really straining under the demands for new capital for these companies. And we're really starting to see that now. I mean, these enormously wealthy companies, which have been accruing hundreds of billions of dollars over 20 years, are now spending down all of that cash they've accrued and are now starting to borrow money. Meta, which is an absolute cash machine in terms of social media advertising, it pulls it in. It's now borrowing money on what are called the private credit markets, which are very like unregulated uh, banking with investors as opposed to actual banks, which is quite a lucrative form of investment. And those markets have been massively expanding to accommodate the AI boom, so much so that they're struggling to find more capital to go into them. You saw Google recently, it raised a 100-year bond in Switzerland, which is a really obscure kind of financial instrument. And the reason it did so was because it was a new sort of funding market to tap because it needed more funds. And this is why we're getting all this talk about IPOs, for example, when they float on the stock exchange, because they're just simply running out of capital to tap. So I think OpenAI has just done a funding round of $100 billion, which is vastly bigger than any other funding round, I think, in history. Anthropic, 30 billion. But really, they're going to have to float to get any more money because there's so much going into this. So it's not simply the technology industry which is making this enormous bet on betting everything it has on AI this is the entirety of global capitalism is betting everything on AI. We're all in, and there's they are very confidently predicting they'll reach this kind of mythical artificial general intelligence, this idea that there will suddenly or what will emerge will be this kind of intelligence which is as superior to all humans essentially by the end of next year or even the end of this year. But there's no real indication that they are closer to understanding what that actually is. And it's all based on this idea that intelligence is all human intelligence, and replicating it is simply a matter of more and more computation, which is a very untested theory. I mean, there are a number of very noted people who would challenge that in a number of ways. So it's an enormous bet, and they don't know where it's going to end, but they're so far in now that the only way is through. They're just going to keep going as far as they can go, and they're going to use all of their wealth, all of their power, all of their political influence to keep pushing this as far as possible. And the other big resistance factor now is a huge amount in the United States, but in other places as well, is resistance to data centers, which is happening everywhere. And people are really, really angry about the fact that it's pushing up electricity prices. They're very concerned about the impacts of AI and the kinds of things they're seeing in terms of the information, in terms of things like what happened in Grok and the scandal with these sexualized images, which is effectively gender-related violence against women, essentially. So all of these problems are really impacting on people and thinking, hold on a minute, where are we going with this? So there's a massive amount of headwinds building up against the industry right now, and they are aware of that, and they can see the challenges ahead.
Great. We have, I guess, four variables that are interdependent in some way. We have the propagation of the data centers. We have the running out of data. We have the limits of physics, and then the limits of, I guess, sociopolitics, or the limits of society in some way. Sorry, maybe it's five, and we have the running out of capital. Seems like everything is running out. So, what breaks first in your mind? Does the capital run out? Does the biosphere run out? Does the data run out? Does the infrastructure run out, and everything under the infrastructure, right? Or does like this French Revolution against AI happening? It's funny. Let me just make the point, and then I'll give the microphone back to you. It's so funny because in almost every sci-fi that revolves around a human uprising against the robots, it's always the humans going against the robots that are controlled by this autonomous force, this AGI, right? This mythical thing. But now it's humans fighting against AI that's run by other humans, right? It's always funny in that way. So let me just push it back to you. What runs out first?
What runs out first? Yeah, that's the big question. I think it's obviously hard to predict, but there are a number of likely scenarios there. All of those things that you mentioned are coming under enormous pressure. I think the one thing which is more certain than any other is that we're going to hit an energy crunch because of the amount of energy that AI data centers require is so much bigger than anything that's come before. It's just immense. And I think this is the really critical factor, which I maybe people don't fully see yet, because when you look at the big sort of digital companies and social media and digital platforms, that kind of business and that kind of business model is based on a software platform which is relatively low cost to produce and maintain and develop. And you produce a social media network like Facebook, or you produce a search engine like Google, and there's some cost to developing and launching that, of course, and that's quite important. But the whole basis of it is this idea of network effects, the idea that you set up this platform, its total addressable market, as they say in Silicon Valley, is the entire planet. And then you can take that and launch it and reach and roll it out to just about everybody in the world. And the cost of each additional user is virtually zero because it's kind of the same platform. Of course, they do increase, but when you look at something like the core service of, say, Meta for Facebook, the actual staff numbers are very, very small. The actual costs are very small, and even the sort of technical side is very, very small. And that's the way digital platforms have run. That's why they become so big, so powerful, and so profitable over the last 20 years. But AI is a completely different type of industry because there are no economies of scale in the same way. In fact, it's the opposite. There are diseconomies of scale. The bigger these things get, the more expensive they are to run. Every single user is more compute. Every single prompt is more compute. There is no way of condensing that down. So actually it's much closer to a really like a heavy industry, like steel or concrete or something like that, where, you know, just more business, more activity just means more energy, more resources needed to do it. So and at the moment they're in this scaling phase because they believe scaling will be the thing that delivers this AGI. And there's not simply not enough energy in the world to support what they're planning to do. And that's the thing. We're running out to a massive degree. They're trying to build as fast as possible new gas turbines in the United States to feed that because it's important to note that I mean they are to some degree renewably powered, but renewable power can't really power data centers in the majority because it's not dispatchable. It's not energy you can store and use as and when you like, unless you have big batteries, but they're not that around yet. So and furthermore, it's just not available. So gas is really the only available energy around to actually power these things, especially 24/7, which is obviously a problem for renewable power. So it's really putting a huge demand on new gas, and there's a massive expansion of gas capacity, but it's still not quick enough to feed the demand of the data centers. So now, for example, there are three big gas turbine makers in the world. And all of them have waiting lists out to, I think, the 2035 or something. That's all backed up. And therefore, what they're doing now is they're going off and getting old jet engines from planes, converting them to use those as sort of makeshift gas turbines to power these data centers. That's like twice as polluting, twice as carbon emitting as dedicated gas turbines. So this is the kind of thing they're doing. They're absolutely desperate for power. And basically, I think it's projected that in the US they will need something like 50 gigawatts of power. That's what they're planning to build. And to give you some scale on that, I mean, in North America, a gigawatt is roughly what a city of, say, three-quarters of a million people would require. I think something like New York City's average demand is about 10 gigawatts. So that's the amount, you know, the kind of current that it needs to keep going. So we're talking about for each of these really big data centers they're building at the moment, it's enough energy to power a reasonably large sized city. And there, so they would need 50 gigawatts. And there's basically about, I think, 25, 28 gigawatts being planned. So there's going to be a shortfall there. And they know that. So, and no one knows how to fill that. There just simply isn't enough capacity. And the kinds of scale they're looking at, if you take like, for example, Sam Altman at OpenAI said his ambitious goal, I think he said, audacious goal, he said, was to get 250 gigawatts of power for data centers by 2035. Now that's basically the same amount of power as India with 1.5 billion people, the third largest electricity grid in the world. And he wants that for OpenAI. This is the kind of scale they're looking at. So you can see from this, and considering how dependent they are on gas, any kind of, I mean, regardless of all of the political issues with climate change and decarbonization, any kind of attempts at decarbonization are going to go out the window with this. Forget it. It's not going to happen. This is just going to totally overtake all of that. So it's a massive planetary issue for us all. So anyway, that's the energy side. There's water, of course, as well, which is a big issue. In terms of what's going to hit first, I mean, for sure, that pressure of finding power is certainly going to hit by the end of this year. There's no way that's not going to happen. With the capital side, it seems very unlikely that there's not going to be some major disruption in the financial picture for the AI industry in this year. And how that manifests is very hard to know. But it could be, for example, a company failing to raise capital, like someone like Oracle, for example, which is, of course, a very established tech company, but it has bet absolutely everything on building data centers for OpenAI,
Hmm.
and on the basis of all this revenue coming in to feed it. And it's very, very exposed. For example, there are all of these other finance companies, these so-called neoclouds, which are specialist data center makers, providers for AI. All of these have very sort of elaborate interconnected funding deals. And if one of those goes, one of the funds, then it could have a domino effect across the whole thing. So I think one way or another, you're going to see that whole financial picture being, at the very least, very unstable this year. And it could be that something could easily happen where, you know, one big failure, say, for example, OpenAI misses its sort of funding projections, or misses its usage targets or revenue, and that really has a knock-on effect and could have a massive impact. And if that happens, then really a huge number. I mean, really, that's the entire stock market. So much of it's weighed up now in those companies that it could be a really systemic impact. But it's really hard to know. I mean, the issue with bubbles is everyone in the industry is saying, yes, this is a bubble, but you never know when it's going to burst. And so everyone just keeps going until it bursts. So it will only really burst when the money runs out. And it's hard to know when that's actually going to be. So there's that. And then with the data, that's an interesting point. They've run out of data. I mean, they have essentially taken in the entire internet in terms of the data models. There is nothing out. They plumbed all of these different libraries of books and hidden places, and there are big lawsuits about that because they're taking so much copyrighted material. What they're doing now is creating synthetic data in order to fill the gaps, whereby they actually just generate through AI different bits of data to build out the data set to make it more effective. But there's a real risk there because as soon as when AIs sort of are trained on AI generated data, there's this effect of model collapse. It basically corrupts, it's like a feedback loop, you can imagine. And so you after three or four iterations of that, you really start to see a corruption in the actual data in it, sort of, and it can actually just collapse completely. So there's a real risk that the more synthetic data they use and the more data spread out into the web, because I mean, so much of our web now is AI generated content, and then that's
Right.
being used to feed the models, that it's going to get more and more corrupt, and that could have a real issue on the overall quality of the models as well. So that's a potential impact. They think they're managing that issue with synthetic data, but whether they are or not remains to be seen. So that's another
Yeah.
issue as well. And I think there's this other issue about the wider, so as you said, the socio-political side, the resistance to it. And I think you'll see that really gather pace. And what's so fascinating there is where it's really crossed the sort of political spectrum as well. It's really cuts across all sorts of political ideologies, and you can see, in the kind of Republican heartlands, the MAGA heartlands in the US, people are really, really angry about this, but also in the Democrat areas as well. So it's one of these issues that can kind of combine and unite people in a way which very few issues that currently do, and we're seeing that everywhere. So. And it's extremely unstable. The next year will be very, very unstable, I think, for the whole industry and for us.
It's somehow AI is causing so much chaos and also so much unity. Who thought that artificial
Yeah, yeah.
intelligence would be the thing that unites,
Yeah.
such a polarized world right now?
Except the chaos merchants are quite a lot richer. They've got all the money.
Exactly. We'll double
Yeah.
click on that. So right now, I want to really tap into the energy
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah.
So we have the technosphere eating the biosphere, and
Yes.
obviously you cannot have an exponential technosphere on a finite biosphere.
Right.
Very, very simple
Mm.
math. Well, when we're talking about gas, That's interesting. So, and again, we're not a conspiratorial podcast, or we're not interested in like random predictions and stuff. But we have seen also in 2026 very shocking geopolitical events.
Yes.
So, could it be said that the pursuit of, you used such a interesting phrase, they're desperate for power, and that could be taken one of two ways.
Mm.
And so, could it be said that the insecurity of generative artificial intelligence right now could lead them to pursue geopolitical agendas for those resources in order to prop up the economy wholesale?
I, I I don't think that's in any way conspiratorial. It's absolutely out there. It's very clear. If you look at, like, for example, uh, the US administration released its global security strategy document late last year, and a critical part of that was AI supremacy. And they are the way they see it, the way the Trump administration sees it, AI is a really critical factor in exerting its dominance over the world. That's what it wants to do. It's a really key matter, and that's obviously kind of driving relations with China as well, and this idea of an AI race. And there are critical vulnerabilities underpinning that because fundamentally, and what we've talked about is energy, and we've talked about the data and the capital, but the other critical thing is the materials that go into AI.
Mhm.
It's a very material infrastructure, and one of the critical materials, obviously, is the microchips that power AI, which are so-called GPU chips. And these are very advanced, huge chips. They're not like the chips in our smartphones, although they're just as advanced, but they're huge. They're like this size. I mean, they're sort of 30 centimeters by 30, and they've got sort of different
Wow.
dies on them. And the thing is, those chips are very advanced, and they're almost exclusively made in Taiwan by one company, TSMC. And this is a critical factor in understanding the relationships between China, the US, and Taiwan. The Taiwanese consider their semiconductor industry, their microchips, the so-called silicon shield. This is their insurance policy against the Chinese invasion and to secure US support, basically. And these factories are incredibly advanced. They're probably the most advanced factories in the world, actually. They have, for example, they have clean rooms which are like 10,000 times cleaner than an operating theatre, whatever that means. They have these incredible machines called lithography machines, which are the size of like a double-decker bus.
Wow.
And they are able to print onto these circuits like parts and circuits, which are, I think, about 13 nanometers, about the size of an antibody. So, I mean, it's just beyond anything else. And the sophistication, nobody else can match this Taiwanese company. It's way ahead of the rest of the world. And that's a huge vulnerability for the United States and for other countries because we're totally dependent on that one company in Taiwan. So we have the US Chips Act, of course. So what has happened is that the US have put enormous pressure on this company, TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Company, to build fabs, as they call these chip foundries, to build those fabs in the US, which is doing. And they're relatively advanced, but they're not as advanced as the ones in Taiwan. So there is this real vulnerability in the supply chains. And then, of course, there's the materials going into the supply chains themselves. And some key critical minerals, which are really important. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is that the entire mineral extraction supply chain of the world has really become completely dominated by China. China has further a huge amount of the mining in itself, but it's also over a course of 20 or 30 years through what was called the Belt and Road strategy. It's kind of invested in, built up its infrastructure with lots of countries around the world, and also its refining infrastructure as well to refine these different metals and materials. So really, it has a commanding position over getting hold of these so-called critical minerals, which includes like metals, like nickel, like copper particularly, but also things like rare earths, of course. And rare earths are critical for all digital technologies, basically. They are a range, I think, of 17 different elements. And they're not particularly rare per se, but what you find is they all combine. They're all found normally together. And they're also incredibly difficult to refine. So, and pretty much all of our sort of high technology, high tech materials and products require rare earths because they provide very specific magnetic properties. So, for example, solar panels and wind turbines, they all need these critical rare earths and critical minerals, but also, of course, microchips as well. And so China has about, I think, 80 or 90% of the refining capacity. And for example, one factor here is Greenland has one of the largest unmined rare earth deposits in the world, and that must be a very big part of, and they've said as much, of this whole issue with Greenland, etc. Likewise, in Canada, in northern Ontario, there's a whole mineral belt there called the Ring of Fire, which they're looking to export. That won't have rare earths, but it has things like nickel, it has things like copper, which is extremely valuable. And I think they're looking to exploit it now. There are lots of First Nation territories where it is who are going to be devastated by that. But that's a big part of the continuing geopolitical tension between Canada and the US. So this is a massive factor. Getting hold of this and getting hold of these rare earths and these critical minerals. It's predicted by the International Energy Agency that, and I think this is a conservative prediction, which doesn't really take into account the AI boom, but they were expecting something like we'd need to increase the mining of critical minerals by about 400% over the next until 2040 in order to feed both our digital and renewable technologies. And of course, you can imagine with things like lithium, it's like 20 times more lithium we need to fuel all of our batteries and cars. Copper is hugely under pressure at the moment. Actually, our production is declining. Yet an AI data center with a gigawatt of power needs something like 30,000 tons of copper. So all of our renewable and power infrastructure requires copper, and we desperately need more of it. And another critical factor I think here, which is really important, is because we have essentially mined most of the sort of most available ore and deposits on the Earth's surface. We are, first of all, we're finding that we're having to mine places with far less concentration. So, for example, if you, I think, mined copper in, I think, the early 1900s, you'd find something like 2 to 4% purity in the copper you're mining. But these days, if you go and try and find copper, it's about 0.2% purity because you're just going for more distant and more different places. So that means much more extraction and much more pollution, much more sort of ecological destruction. And the other thing is because you need to go more and more remote, it's estimated that 56%, I believe, of all new sources of extraction will be on indigenous territories. And these are places, of course, it's not simply that they're indigenous territories, but it's no coincidence that those are also some of the most pristine ecosystems in the world as well, where we have most biodiversity, in the Amazon basin, but also, as I was saying, in North Ontario. And these are some of the largest natural carbon sinks in the world because they're huge peatlands, So the planetary impact of this will be absolutely immense. And at some point, if we just continue this way, we are going to hit all manner of carbon warming effects, which could have a sort of an overturning impact. So the stakes are extremely high here, and we're just accelerating towards some form of climate collapse as a result of this.
The stakes are very high, and it's not at all clear to me. It was never clear to me why they're so high. So let me just say more about that. In the 19th century, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but in the 19th century, physicists thought that there was this fifth element called the ether.
Right.
They had all these theories and all these equations and stuff, and eventually the ether was proved a nothing burger.
Mm.
In the 20th century, we had nuclear weapons. And we had this arms race because the power of nuclear weapons was so immense and so in our faces that basically the two superpowers at the time chose to pursue the weapons of power and the ideologies of power to uphold, well, to pursue the weapons of power to uphold their ideologies of power.
Hmm.
Now in the 21st century, we have AI.
Yeah.
But folks like yourself and many others, including myself, are saying, well, the entire apparatus of AI from 1956, but even from Homer, was to create human intelligence, right? To put human intelligence in a machine. And we're not doing that wholesale. We're kind of doing a little bit of that, but it's not really human intelligence. It's like this completely different thing. But for some reason, it seems analogous to like in the 19th century, every superpower on Earth being like, oh my God, the ether is that thing. We need to put all this money and time and energy and resources and change our entire geopolitical strategy to pursue the ether. And physicists are like, well, but the ether is not, it doesn't exist. Right? Like there are no fundamental theories to back this up. You guys have just taken the ball and run with it. The point I'm trying to get at is why it's not just that the AI industry is built on a house of cards.
Mm.
We've talked about that. You've brilliantly dissected it, so thank you for that. But it's also the fact, is there no one telling Trump or telling Xi, hey, this technology that you think is going to, rein in the new whatever hegemony of power, it's not doing what we all thought it was going to do. Like you literally don't need to pursue it. And is this about like psychologies? Is this about just like how would you put it? Like it's just peacocking? Like what is this right now? What are we in?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like we're chasing the big white whale in Moby Dick, this
Right.
mythical artificial general intelligence or super intelligence or powerful intelligence. And it's always just a little bit over the corner. And I think this is so important. And why are we doing this? Why are we so captivated by this thing? And what is it or at least what is it these tech, companies, these tech CEOs are so
Right.
mesmerized by
So
here? And why do they
let me
want this?
add more layers to this, just for a second, because
Yeah,
it kind of it's one of the cruxes of the conversation.
yeah.
We've just talked for about 40 minutes
Mm,
about how we don't have the energy, we don't have the money,
mm,
we don't have the political backing wholesale, we don't have the social backing, we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the materials, we don't have the unity to pursue this agenda. And the entire agenda is to get towards artificial general intelligence,
mm.
which again, nobody has accurately defined to the point where everybody agrees on that definition.
Yes.
So we don't have anything to get to a destination that doesn't exist. Again, I'll give it back to you, but how does that work?
Right. I have my own views on that, I guess, and I'd say I would like to think about that in two levels really. One is with the tech industry itself, who are driving this whole boom forward very obviously, and I think it's really interesting there. If you think back to the pandemic, say that time, and you remember how everybody was online, and then all of the big tech companies, well, everyone else was struggling with everything. They were kind of going, you know, they were expanding at a level they hadn't done before. It was a huge expansion. You saw their profits go up, their revenues go up. You saw their share prices go through the roof over that period because suddenly everyone thought, okay, everything's going to be online forever. And what was interesting there was a point there where it plateaued out, I think around 22 as we're coming out of that. And they realized they'd overspent. And also, there was this fundamental point that where their investors and people in the capital markets were saying, hold on a minute, these companies are so big, they've got nowhere else to go. There's no growth left in them. And they're turning from being these high growth stocks to these kind of mature stocks, which are just basically sitting on their monopolies and just pulling in their monopoly rents. And that's a very different thing. Once you're a growth stock, you're going to have massive multiples of earnings on your stock shares, and that's very useful. And of course, everything is driven by the share price because all of the senior people in all tech companies have big share options on their companies. That's how it works. So having a growth stock is completely different to having a stable sort of plateauing stock, and that provoked within Silicon Valley a real existential crisis. And you saw the stock price really drop. I think Amazon dropped by about a half, Meta dropped by about two-thirds, and it was fundamentally about this thing of, well, these companies got so big, there's simply nowhere for them to grow into, and that was a thing. And it was around this time, amazingly, that ChatGPT appeared. And then suddenly there's this option. And what ChatGPT is offering and what AI is offering, which had always been a very abstract thing, which Google was working on, that OpenAI was working on, but never, didn't seem to be something yet to work on that anyone could bet on. Suddenly it gave them a future of unlimited exponential growth. It was like the whole ethos of Silicon Valley, of exponential growth, of network effects, of the power law, where you have vast gains to the winners in all markets, was back on. And basically, it came at the perfect time for them. I mean, it's almost like, I mean, it couldn't have happened in a better time. And although I don't believe that there was anything sort of planned around that at all, I think actually when you look at it, OpenAI had no idea that ChatGPT was going to be such a big impact, to have such a big impact. It became the vehicle by which Silicon Valley could reestablish its sense of, oh, we are in the business of exponential growth. And that was critical for driving it forward. And really, there are no other ideas out there. So it's betting everything on this because there's nothing else out there. And what it offers is a level of growth and economic power and dominance completely outside the realms of anything we've seen before. That's what they think they're going to achieve if they get to this artificial general intelligence. And I think that's what's driving the overall thing because there's really nothing else out there. So it has to be this. And actually what happens is that that's become the driving force actually of the wider global economy. Because actually, when you look at the wider economy, you can see that, really since 2008 with the big global crash, most of the world has actually stagnated in that time, outside of China and the US. US has grown because of exploiting new gas and because of the tech companies. But that money is coming from the rest of the world. So everywhere else, certainly where I am in Europe, I mean, most of the countries here, we've flatlined for the last 15 years. And in reality, that means the prices are going up. People are actually getting poorer. So that's what's happening. China, of course, has been growing. And really, nobody has any real idea how to get growth back again, except for AI. It's the only option on the table. So really, I think that's the key element here. It's really fundamentally about growth. We have to have growth to keep the whole thing going, because it's only with growth that you can justify the massive inequalities we have and all of the different social fractures that we have. Because it's always, look, don't worry. As we grow, you're all going to get richer, so it's going to be fine in the future. But of course, that whole idea, that whole sort of sales pitch is just falling apart because most people are seeing, even in the United States, it's very obvious that people they talk about the K-shaped economy, which is basically where the 10% or even less are soaring upwards, but everyone else is dropping down below the horizon. So it really is keeping the whole idea of our global economic system, the idea of AI, it allows us to drive forward and find something, and that's what's driving it on, and that's why all of this money is being bet on it, in my view.
I want to end on a note of hope,
Oh,
but I don't want to ask the naive question of how do we fix this?
hmm.
Or what are your thoughts on the future in a positive sense? But I do want to ask from your perspective, is there, one of the things that I've been hearing in podcasts recently, I think in a podcast back from 2020, but it was burned into my psyche, is that we look to our blind spots in order to do business there. And so, what is the kind of obvious thing that we can do to fix, not fix, I don't think we're going to fix this wholesale, and I don't think that there's just one thing to do in order to fix everything. I wish there was. I would love a superintelligence to help us fix the problem of superintelligence. Um, but where does that kind of, if we start doing this in this category, then we can get on the right track. Does that exist in the realm of politics? Do we need to regulate the amount of data centers per country, or do we need to teach children, hey, let's get AI out of schools, Like if we get AI out of schools and we don't try to incorporate it, then people are not necessarily going to grow up with this reliance on AI. Is it let's figure out a way to, I don't know, make data centers more efficient? Let's get manufacturing companies to say no, we're not going to sell to OpenAI. I don't know, just what is that one potential that we can do, and where does that potential exist in your mind?
Yeah. I think, well, certainly it's all of the above. It's got to be all this and more. I think we have fundamentally got to shift our relationship, our mindset, our approach to the technologies around us and think about them very differently. And what I am hopeful about is I'm starting to see that in a lot of different places, in a lot of different ways, in places you don't expect as well. And I think we've gone down a route where we've kind of been sort of we've been on that kind of it's like one of those airport travelators, where you just got you're just like pushed along. There's not really no way off until you get to the end. And we've been sort of kind of corralled into this with this understanding that the way our technology trajectory is inevitable and unstoppable, and all we can do is just sit there and watch whilst technology companies get their latest technologies onto us. And I think you're starting to see people really resist that and really take steps against it in different ways. And I think it's about us all taking a bit of agency and recognizing, exactly as we were talking earlier around, you were saying, actually, I'm going to bypass using ChatGPT for this particular answer. I'm just going to do it myself. And I think we've really got to grasp that there is a real cost to convenience, that there's a real cost to the frictionless user experience that we've been offered, that that cost is hidden, but it's actually, and it's quite subtle. And whilst the gains are immediate, they're quite superficial, and the actual costs are harder to see, but are far more profound. And we've got to sort of lean into those and understand them. And I think people are starting to realize that sometimes friction is good in our lives. Sometimes having things that don't fit together, where we have to think and take action for ourselves and think for ourselves, is a good step to take. And I think that can happen on a number of different levels. And for me, that's really important to do in our own lives. I think it's really important I mean, I've been involved in activism for a long time, and I think when you're involved in climate activism and things, you quickly understand that everything's systemic, and then you think, well, there's nothing I can do as an individual. They're just trying to make me be a consumer, and that's not going to change anything. But actually, I think it's really important that we think about our own things in our own lives, because not because it changes the world, but because it actually changes us and it changes our relationship. And so, I mean, for example, I got my phone. I mean, it's really hard. I mean, the phone is one of our key elements, and we feel lost without our phones these days. But what I've done is I've like simplified it down, and I've taken off all the apps, and now it's black and white, And so it's
It's a dumb
turned
phone.
off all the notifications, so the whole thing, and it makes a huge difference, you know. And those kind of steps where you're taking control of the technology and saying, actually, no, what we need is technology that serves us, not technology that makes us serve it. You know, we need to make sure that we get out of that abusive loop we're in. But it's also about the systemic level. And I think it's really exciting to see the way people are mobilizing about data centers. I think what I've seen in activism around the world in different issues, it's always when you have big infrastructure, those are the targets which generate the most likely gains for activists who have no power other than to put their bodies in the way. And I think, you know, we're at that point now where people see the purpose in actually saying, no, we don't want more data centers. Let's not have more data centers. Let's make do with what we've got. And I think we just got to fundamentally reverse the polarity actually of our technology, where technology has mirrored the rest of the world, where it's always about bigger, faster, larger, more expensive, more resources. And we've got to go the other way and say, instead of let's how big can we make it? How far can we scale it? It's more like, well, how small can we make it to do the things that we want to do? And we've got to think about what it is we actually need and what's the minimum impact our technology have for us to get there. And I think in that way, we've also got to reprioritize just human connection, you know, just doing things with other people in real life and actually, you know, not allowing AI to become our sort of main emotive connective point. We need to think about what it is that really makes us human and what else we want to be as humans. And I feel that those kinds of cultures are emerging. But I think we've also, they're not going to come at us. They're not going to, what we see around us is what there is. The reality is there's no great bandwagon we're going to jump on. We have to create it ourselves. So we just have to make those changes ourselves in our own lives. But we can do that. And I think what I've found, and admittedly I work in my own area, but I think this is quite widespread. More and more of us are finding that we're sick to death of the way our relationship with technology in general. And that some of our friends really connect with that kind of idea too. So we can, and when we do things with friends, with our families, with our loved ones, we do things together, like sort of moving off one particular toxic platform, moving away from AI, going and meeting in a park instead of meeting online. Those kinds of things, I think, have a potential to make an enormous difference because there are millions and millions of other people around the world wanting to do the same and doing the same as well. And so, you know, we're all little bubbles, but sometimes when they grow, those bubbles join up and we can be an alternative kind of AI bubble, an anti-AI bubble.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
We desperately need that anti-AI bubble. If you had a magic wand and you could solve one problem in the world, what would it be and why?
Um, I mean, our fundamental question. I mean, this is, I guess, what I feel about AI. It feels to me as if it's like we're just asking the wrong question. This comes back to why are we doing this? And we're just asking this question about how we can create the super intelligence. I don't think we've got the world's full of intelligence. There are all
Hmm.
manner of human and more than human intelligences out there, and all of those have got huge amounts that we don't fully understand from our point of view, and there's so much to learn there. We don't need more synthetic intelligence. The fundamental question we as a species need to explore, and the thing we don't know the answer to is how is it that you get 8 billion people to live on a planet such as Earth and live within the balance and the constraints of its own biosystem? We do not know how to do that. We know some of the answers, but we don't know all of it. We think we know the answer, but we don't. And that's our fundamental question. We need to understand how to do that. And everything we do as a species needs to be focused on that right now because ultimately we are heading towards a collapse of some sort. And that's something within decades. It's not within centuries. It's maybe even less than that. So we really need to focus on that more than anything else. And everything else falls by the wayside. But I mean, I'm sure that focusing on that means actually addressing a huge amount of other issues as a planet as well.
Probably a conversation for the next time you're on the podcast, if you would be so willing. I've
Yeah, I'd
really
love to.
enjoyed this conversation. Um, why are humans, Homo sapiens, the wise man,
So
which is
called.
funny that we gave ourselves, yeah, so called.
I think there's a lot in
Um,
there, isn't there?
oh, absolutely. Why are we so obsessed with creating more and super intelligence when we ourselves, number one, wield intelligence,
Mm,
but don't fundamentally understand the depth of our intelligence? Why are we trying to create better hammers without understanding first how the hammer works?
yeah. I always have this feeling with humans is that we're so clever, we're stupid. And and it's probably our biggest weakness is is our capacity for cognition and our incapacity to understand our own limitations, or at least I think that's a very partial view. I should say that's from my particular Western mindset. I think a huge number of humans are far more mature in these things than we are, um, and it is interesting, isn't it, that we think, or some of us think that intelligence is going to solve all these problems, where there's no evidence to support that whatsoever. I think it's also it's striking how in Silicon Valley they really fetishize intelligence and always have, smartness. I can remember years ago going to some Google event in Istanbul when all these riots were happening because they were sort of uprising, and they had they were talking there. They had Vint Cerf, who was presented as the godfather of the internet, and he was saying, "Yeah, and they had a big tent. There was actually literally a big tent. That was very symbolic." And they said, "Yeah, we're just getting all the smart people together in one place. That's what we do. And if we just get all the smart people together, we'll just solve all the world's problems. It's going to be fine." And it was like, and I had my hand up to ask a question, but no one came to me. And I wanted to ask, but I'm not smart. What about me? And I think, most of the world in relation to this isn't very smart as far as Silicon Valley is concerned. And that's part of the problem here. But actually, probably those people are probably the smartest of all in terms of the people we need to actually solve problems. So we do have this very mixed up way of thinking about what's really important and what's really valuable in terms of understanding the world around us. And this issue of intelligence is a striking one. I was thinking about whether actually intelligence may be a feeling rather than anything intellectual. It may be actually something completely on a different level because it's so striking how with all this effort around artificial intelligence, we don't know what intelligence is. If
Right.
anything, artificial intelligence research is actually giving us a really good indication of what intelligence isn't. It's sort of showing us where the gaps are in our own understanding, and that's probably one of the most interesting things about it. So we do have this very odd view of it, and I think it really, I think you could date that back to really the kind of sort of the scientific revolution in Western culture and the Enlightenment and those kinds of ideas about human supremacy and what that means. And of course, that was so heavily integrated and enmeshed with colonialism, with extractivism, with all of these ideas of supremacy, and became very important to it. And so it's all extremely problematic, and it's kind of taking us in the wrong direction. And we kind of need to sort of retrace the steps a little bit and think about all of those other cultures, all of those other knowledge systems around us, which have a very different understanding of what intelligence really is and how you relate to the world around you. And I feel like that's where our future really lies.
I remember, if my memory serves me correctly, I think I remember that I read something about the ancient Egyptians thought that intelligence resided in the heart rather than the brain.
Right.
That's one. I've also really misunderstood this kind of not acceptance, but this like pseudo obviousness that intelligence just resides in the brain.
Yeah.
Like the brain is the seat of intelligence.
Yeah.
Sure, intellectual intelligence and mental intelligence, but emotions kind of go everywhere,
Very much
are
so.
generated everywhere. We never pay attention to gut intelligence, for example. Where does intuition come from? The gut has, millions of neurons. The heart has tens of thousands of neurons. Not that neurons are the definer of intelligence, but I'm really confused at why we kind of like procrustionized intelligence down to whatever happens up here.
Yes.
That to me is like it's I still I'm unable to put it into words, but it makes sense in my head, which is the funny part about being human, I guess. But you know, we're the Homo sapiens, we're the wise man, whatever, and in pursuing trying to recreate human intelligence and put that in a machine because that's something we should do for some reason, we're shortening ourselves, we're like concising ourselves, we're breaking ourselves, we're diluting ourselves down into something that we can understand superficially in order to recreate that and then say that is human intelligence broadly.
Exactly.
And again, I'm not sure where that happened, number one. And number two, what maybe it's to do with the ego or something else, but why is it that we took the path towards externalities rather than internal understanding?
Mm.
That to me is not obvious at all, because again, when you're talking about we need to change our relationship with technology, you and I can do that right now. We can
Mm.
download Opal and we can put all these parameters around and we can duct tape our laptops so that we're not on it unless we're doing the 9 to 5. But that's not changing our relationship.
Right, right, right.
To change our relationship would be to say, you know what? I actually prefer looking Alistair in the eyes more than I do going on my phone right now.
Yeah,
Like that's my
yeah.
internal realization.
Yes, yes.
Do you have any? It's a little bit more abstract. Do you have any thoughts along these fronts?
Absolutely. And I think you hit on some really important things. I mean, one key thing about the intelligence route we're going down is, of course, by necessity for the AI industry, intelligence must mean all the things that can be datafied and nothing more. And of course, that's an extraordinarily limited version of intelligence. And if you think about it, we've only been able to put things into digital data for what 30, 40 years. So really, it's a tiny, tiny fraction of human history, of planetary history that we're putting there. And of course, there's so much richness in intelligence that cannot be captured there. I mean, intelligence must be embodied. It must be about our relationship, our embodied experience with the world around us. It must also be connective to the things around us. And we know so much in terms of biology about the fact that really, a sense of self is a very much an artificial construct. That we're really very sort of permeable membranes, and the same with intelligence. Our intelligence is obviously dependent on the people around us. My intelligence, your intelligence here, is wholly dependent in this conversation on each other. And then there's some really interesting and important elements of it around things like, for example, time as well, and cumulative intelligence, knowledge over time. And one thing that large language models simply don't have is any sense of time. There's no sense of a sequence, and they don't have any sense of how to generalize and get underlying laws out of the information they have. So they're always learning everything for the new time. So a great irony is they don't actually learn. They get trained, and then what they have is that data set, but they can't actually learn from the basis of what they do with that data set. And I was and you mentioned emotion, that's really striking because there was a really interesting interview I saw recently with a really sort of prominent developer, formerly of OpenAI, called Ilya Sutskever, who was one of the most influential sort of AI sort of researchers in creating large language models. And he's gone off and started his own company. But he was saying he was musing on this and saying, well, I'm actually struggling to see if we're going to get to AGI. He was one of the most vocal advocates. And what he was talking about a particular research, I think it was a neurological research project in which it was saying, they were looking at people who had brain injuries, and they lost their emotions. They lost their capacity for emotion. And what they found with these people is they lost their complete cognitive ability as well. They lost their
Wow.
capacity to analyze and process. And he was actually asking that specific question. Hold on a minute. Is intelligence actually an emotion as much as it is a cognition? Isn't that
Mhm.
something fundamentally essential? And of course, our intelligence is deeply empathetic as well. It's deeply about how we can understand and project ourselves into perceiving things from other perspectives. So much of our intelligence is that. So there are all these subtle dimensions and aspects of intelligence that there's I mean, there's no way that a machine can encapsulate all of that. And why would we want to try even? What would be the purpose? So I think you're right. It's such an there's such a complex and subtle thing, and there's so many things in intelligence that this very limited, quite juvenile understanding of what intelligence is, essentially around doing tests and winning them, is a really, really limited way of thinking about things.
Again, I want to end on a note of positivity. What gives you hope in the world?
Oh, I think we're in some shape or form turning some kind of a corner. I do feel like more and more people are beginning to see that we need to fundamentally change the way we relate to the world with each other. We relate to the economy, relate to technology, and all of these things. So I absolutely see that. I see a lot of hope in people. I see a lot of hope in for me. I get great joy out of, and I'm increasingly getting find myself much more attuned and more focused on finding connection with the natural world around me as and when I can find it. And I think more and more people are getting those kind of sense. I think we're going for a bit of a tricky patch, but I kind of feel like, you know, the direction we're going, I just feel as if it's going to be pretty unstable and pretty difficult the next few years. But I do feel there's a possibility that we can really find our way forward in a much more positive and much more collaborative, connective, ecologically minded, much more balanced way. I do think that's possible. I still think that's possible. And so for me, there's
Love it.
always hope there. But I think, when it comes to hope, I'm kind of a little bit with Franz Kafka, as I'm in Berlin, and so was he. And he said to a friend, he said, "Of course, there's hope. There's always hope, but not for us." And and I feel like sometimes I think hope is a little bit of a crutch. It's a bit of a palliative. If you just have hope, then it allows you not to do anything and wait for things. And actually, there's a liberation in actually saying, well, hope is not about waiting for something to happen in the future. Hope is about just dealing with things, not knowing how things are turning out and doing them anyway, and just knowing that you've just got to go forward in a particular route. So I kind of feel like hope holds us back a little bit in the sense of, oh, we must have hope. And it's like, no, we're in a bad spot. Things are going wrong in a very serious way all over the place in multiple dimensions. We can all see that. We've just got to get on with what we're doing. We don't know how it's going to turn out, but we just got to do what's right. And we've got to seek solidarity, connection, and joy with all people and all life around us. And that's what gives us resilience. That's what gives us sort of life force, and that's what we should be looking for.
Alistair, thank you so much for this conversation. Where can we find you online to keep up with your work and to get more of these incredible pieces of knowledge?
Oh, thank you. It's been a great conversation. Really enjoyed talking to you. I have a newsletter it's on Substack. It's called Reclaimed Systems under my name, and I just have a website as well. And at the moment, oddly enough, it's slightly complicated, but I am using LinkedIn quite a lot. That's, I think, where you found me.
Nice. Yep.
But I find it somewhere which is quite nice to do short little pieces of like little bursts of short sort of reports on different updates on the AI world and ecology and things. So I'm easy to find there. Not many people called Alistair around. But yeah, there and my newsletter and yeah, I'm always welcome. Nice to see more people join.
Absolutely. Your content is very, very bingeable, and I recommend people do binge it because there are a lot of pretty shocking things that
Great.
you report on that just doesn't get covered in the mainstream press.
Oh wow, that's
So I appreciate the work that you do and the fact that you make it super accessible. Um, Alistair, thank you so much for today.
thank you. It's really, really great to talk.